The kitchen was still on fire when Theodore Barnett rode back to his own property. He saw the orange glow from half a mile out, a flickering column of amber light cutting through the black New Mexico night, and his chest seized up so hard and fast, he thought for a moment his heart had simply decided to quit. He drove his heels into his horse's flanks, and the animal surged forward, hooves hammering the dry red earth, and Theodore was already off the saddle before the horse fully stopped, already running toward the ranch house with his coat half off his shoulders, already screaming a name he had no right to be screaming because she was not his. She was not supposed to matter. Birdie Grady had been on his property for exactly 47 days, and he had spent every single one of those days reminding himself that she was temporary, that she was a stranger, that the arrangement between them was purely contractual and entirely without sentiment. He had told himself that so many times it had begun to sound like a prayer. Now, he was running toward a burning house screaming her name like a man who had never learned to pray for anything else. He hit the front door at full speed, and it crashed open, and the smoke rolled out to meet him like a living thing, thick and hot and searching. He pulled his bandana up over his face and moved through the front room toward the kitchen at the back of the house, following the source of the light. The kitchen was not burning the way he had feared. The hearth had simply been overved, a stack of cedar logs piled so high that the flames had spilled over the iron grate and caught the edge of the wooden board he used as a chopping surface, and the board was burning merrily in the middle of the stone floor. But the house was not coming down. The stone walls held everything, and the fire was eating itself into smallness even as he watched. Birdie was not in the kitchen. He checked every room with his heart hammering and his hands shaking with a terror he had not felt since the winter of 1872, since the last time he had run through smoke calling a name and found only silence. He found her on the back porch, sitting on the top step with her knees drawn up to her chest and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, watching the stars with an expression that was either peace or devastation, and he could not yet tell which. She turned when she heard him behind her. She looked at his face, at the wild-eyed horror still printed there, at the bandana around his neck and the soot on his hands, and something shifted in her expression that he would spend a long time afterward trying to name. "The board caught," she said quietly. "I put it out before I came outside. I am sorry about the board." Birdie. Her name came out of him like something he had been holding underwater. I know what you thought." She held his gaze. "You thought I was gone." He did not answer that. He sat down on the step beside her instead, closer than he had permitted himself to sit in 47 days, and stared out at the dark desert and the enormous sky, and tried to remember how to be cold. He could not quite manage it. The territory of New Mexico in the year 1883 was not a gentle place. The land itself seemed to discourage softness, the way it baked under a relentless sun and froze under a relentless sky, and offered its beauty only at a distance, never warmly, never easily. Men who survived here long enough tended to take on the qualities of the land itself. They became hard and dry and capable of enduring extremes. They learned not to need things. Theodore Barnett had been in the territory for 11 years, and he had learned not to need things better than almost anyone. He had come west from Tennessee in 1872 at the age of 26, which put him now at 37, though most people who looked at him guessed older. He had the kind of face that weather carves rather than simply ages, all angles and stillness, dark eyes under a heavy brow, a jaw that seemed permanently set against the possibility of softness. He ran 4,000 acres of cattle land outside the town of Cimarron with 2 hired hands, a cantankerous cook named Amos who had quit twice and come back both times, and an absolute minimum of human connection. The people of Cimarron said that Theodore Barnett was the coldest man in the territory. They said it without malice, mostly. They said it the way you might describe a particular stretch of high desert, as a fact of geography. He paid his bills on time. He was fair to his workers. He showed up at the occasional town meeting when something genuinely required his attention. He did not drink himself into trouble or gamble away his land or chase other men's wives or pick fights at the saloon. He simply kept himself at a temperature that discouraged intimacy, and people respected that even as they wondered at it. What people did not know, because Theodore had taken great care to ensure they did not know it, was why. He kept that particular piece of information locked behind the same cold wall he kept everything else, and he had been keeping it there for 11 years, and he had intended to keep it there for whatever years remained to him. Then the letter arrived from Santa Fe in the 3rd week of June, and everything he had built so carefully began to come apart at the seams. The letter was from a lawyer named Hargrove, representing the estate of one Samuel Grady, recently deceased, who had contracted with Theodore's land solicitor 2 years prior for the eventual purchase of a 40-acre parcel on Theodore's western boundary. The sale had never been completed because Samuel Grady had died owing money he could not pay, and the 40 acres were not technically in dispute. But the situation was complicated by the fact that Samuel Grady had a daughter, one Miss Birdie Grady, age 24, currently residing in Santa Fe with no income, no property, and no prospects, who had apparently written to every name in her father's correspondence on the chance that one of them might offer her a position. The letter from Birdie herself was tucked inside the lawyer's letter, a single folded page in a small, precise hand that managed to be proud and desperate at the same time, which Theodore recognized immediately as the most dangerous combination a person could present to the world. She wrote that she was not asking for charity. She wrote that she could cook, keep house, manage accounts, help with cattle work in a limited capacity, and perform general labor of whatever kind was appropriate. She wrote that she was aware the position she was proposing was unconventional, and that she would fully understand if it was declined. She wrote that she was asking because her father had spoken of Theodore Barnett as a man of his word, and she had no other men of their word left to appeal to. Her father had spoken of Theodore Barnett. Theodore held that sentence in his hands for a long time. He had met Samuel Grady exactly twice, both times briefly, during the negotiations over the parcel. He did not recall making any particular impression. He did not recall saying anything a man might repeat to his daughter as evidence of good character. But the 40 acres were genuinely in legal ambiguity, and the honest truth was that Theodore needed a cook because Amos had quit for what he claimed was the final time and departed for Albuquerque 3 weeks ago, and the ranch house was a disaster in ways that had begun to affect his sleep. He told himself those were the only reasons he wrote back. He told himself that as he sealed the envelope, and again as he handed it to the postmaster, and again as he rode home and put the whole matter out of his mind for the 3 weeks it took for her reply to arrive confirming that she would accept the position and would arrive on the morning stage from Santa Fe on the 8th of July. He told himself that as he rode into Cimarron on the 8th of July to meet the stage from Santa Fe arrived 40 minutes late in a cloud of dust that settled over everything, and the passengers climbed down one by one into the punishing mid-morning heat. Theodore stood with his horse at the rail and watched them emerge and identified Birdie Grady immediately, which surprised him because he had had no description. She was not what he had imagined, though he would have been hard-pressed to say what he had imagined. She was medium height, slim but not fragile, with dark hair pinned up under a straw hat that had seen better days, and a dress that was clean and carefully mended and spoke clearly of reduced circumstances managed with tremendous dignity. She carried a single large bag and a smaller one, and she looked around the main street of Cimarron with eyes that were assessing rather than overwhelmed, taking stock the way a person takes stock of terrain they are not sure yet whether to trust. Then she looked directly at Theodore, and he had the sudden vertiginous sensation of being seen through rather than simply seen, which he did not enjoy. He was not accustomed to that sensation. He stepped forward and extended his hand with the minimum courtesy the situation required. "Miss Grady, Theodore Barnett." She took his hand and shook it once firmly, the way a man might, and looked up at him with dark amber eyes that were steady and direct and complicated in ways he did not want to examine. "Mr. Barnett, I appreciate you meeting me. I needed to be in town anyway." He picked up the larger of her bags before she could argue. "The wagon is this way." She did not seem offended by his curtness. She simply fell into step beside him with the quiet adaptability of someone who had already made her calculations and decided this was manageable. He found that slightly unnerving. Most people reacted to his manner by either becoming obsequious or becoming prickly, both of which he found tiresome. She simply matched his pace and said nothing until they reached the wagon. "My father mentioned you were direct," she said then, arranging herself on the wagon seat with her smaller bag balanced on her lap. "He said you were the kind of man who said exactly as much as needed saying, and not one word more. Your father said that based on 2 brief conversations about land. He was a good judge of character." She looked ahead at the road. "He was wrong about some men and right about most. I believe he was right about you." Theodore climbed up beside her and took the reins and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that, and because the sensation of being accurately assessed by a woman he had known for 4 minutes was doing something strange to the cold architecture he had spent years perfecting. He drove in silence, and she let him, and that was perhaps the first indication that Birdie Grady was going to be more difficult to manage than he had anticipated. The ranch house sat against a low rise of red rock with the Cimarron River in the near distance, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as a backdrop that would have been beautiful if Theodore had been the kind of man who paid attention to that sort of thing. He pulled up in front of the house and climbed down, and she was down before he could come around to her side, which was sensible if slightly irritating in the way that competence can be irritating to people who expect to manage everything themselves. She looked at the house with the same assessing gaze she had turned on the town, taking in the weathered siding and the solid stone foundation and the vegetable garden that had gone to ruin from neglect and the front porch with the chair that needed a new leg. He watched her register each thing and file it away and say nothing about any of it, and he found himself curious, despite himself, what her conclusions were. "The kitchen is through the back," he said. "Your room is off the kitchen. Amos slept there previously, so it may need airing." "That is fine." She picked up her large bag. "Where are your hands?" "Bunkhouse is south of the main house. Cal and Denny, they will not bother you." "They are not a bother," she said simply. "If they take meals at the house, I will need to know how many I am cooking for." "3," he said. "Or 2 if Denny's in the south pasture." She nodded and walked into the house, and he stood in the yard and listened to her footsteps move through the front room and then the kitchen and then the small back room, methodical and unhurried, and he had the peculiar sensation of his own house becoming slightly unfamiliar to him, which he did not know how to account for. He had hired a housekeeper. He had solved a practical problem. That was all. He repeated that to himself as he went to the barn to check on the horses, and he was almost certain he believed it. The first week was easier than he expected, which made him suspicious. Birdie Grady cooked with a competence that bordered on alchemy. Within 24 hours of her arrival, the kitchen smelled of things Theodore had not smelled since Tennessee: baked bread and rendered fat, and something with wild sage that made his chest ache in a way he chose not to investigate. She fixed the vegetable garden in 2 days, with a focused ferocity that alarmed him slightly. She found the account ledgers in his desk and organized them without being asked and left them on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "I found an error in the March entries. I have corrected it. Please verify." He verified it. The error had cost him $14 over 3 months. He stood in the kitchen with the ledger open and looked at her correction and did not know what to say about it, so he said nothing. Cal and Denny were enchanted by her inside of 48 hours. Cal was 22 and guileless, and he blushed every time she spoke to him, and Denny was 40 and had been married twice and treated her with a gruff, instinctive protectiveness that Theodore noted and did not entirely understand his own reaction to. He was not jealous. He was not in a position to be jealous of anything. He was simply observant. He was always observant. It was not sentiment. It was management. Birdie herself was harder to read than he wanted to admit. She was cheerful in a way that was not empty, the cheerfulness of someone who had decided to be cheerful as a deliberate act of will rather than because things were easy. He caught glimpses sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, of something underneath it that was quieter and lonelier and more complicated. He caught her once standing at the kitchen window in the early morning looking out at the mountains with an expression that made him feel he was seeing something he was not meant to see, and he backed away from the doorway before she could turn and find him there. He told himself this was about boundaries. He told himself a good employer maintained professional distance. He told himself all the things he had gotten very good at telling himself. What he did not tell himself, what he refused to examine, was the thing that woke him up at 3 in the morning on the 12th day of her residence and kept him awake for 2 hours, which was the simple fact that his house had stopped being silent in a way that was beginning to feel necessary rather than merely tolerable. The silence had been his preference for 11 years. He had cultivated it. He had protected it. The silence was the sound of a man who had learned not to need anything, and it had served him perfectly well. He did not know what to do with a house that smelled of bread and sage, and rang occasionally with the sound of Birdie singing quietly to herself while she worked, something low and southern and old, songs that probably came from a childhood he would never know about. He simply endured it and kept his distance, and told himself it would not last. It was Denny who gave him the first piece of the true picture. On a Thursday morning, when Theodore came in from the range to find his hired hand leaning in the kitchen doorway watching Birdie reshape a pie crust with the expression of a man guarding a door. "Cal told me something," Denny said, not moving from the doorway, talking quietly enough that the words would not carry inside. "About why she left Santa Fe." Theodore looked at him. "I did not ask." "I know you did not ask, but you should know." Denny glanced into the kitchen and then back. Her father owed a man named Cutter Voss gambling debt. Big one. Voss runs the tables at the 2 main establishments in Santa Fe, and he is not the kind of man who considers a debt cleared by death. He has been leaning on her to settle it. She left because he was getting persuasive about it. Theodore held very still. "How persuasive?" he said. "Persuasive enough that she left in a hurry," Denny said. "She told Cal the full amount is about $300. Voss has told her she can work it off his way or find another way, and she did not care for either of his proposals." The cold in Theodore Barnett's chest became something else at that, something that was not cold at all but that he recognized from a long time ago, a narrow, heated, dangerous thing that lived at the back of his ribs, and that he had thought he had disciplined out of himself years ago. "She did not tell me this," he said. "She is proud," Denny said, "and she probably did not want you to think you were taking on someone else's trouble when you already did her a kindness by hiring her." Theodore said nothing. He went back out to his horse and rode 3 more hours on the range, which was where he went when he needed to think without his face being visible to anyone. And when he came back in the early evening, Birdie was making supper, and she looked up when he came in from the yard, and he looked at her, and the thing at the back of his ribs made itself known again. "Miss Grady," he said, "tell me about Cutter Voss." The color drained out of her face and then came back twice as hard, and for a moment he thought she was going to deny it. She did not. She put down the spoon she was holding and turned to face him squarely, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been braced for a particular blow and has decided to receive it standing upright. "Who told you?" she said. "It does not matter who told me. It matters to me because I did not tell anyone for a reason." Her voice was very controlled. "Whatever Denny said, what Denny said was that you left Santa Fe because a dangerous man had a claim on you that you could not satisfy, and you were trying to get far enough away that he could not collect it." He kept his voice level. "Is that accurate?" "Approximately." She held his gaze. "My father owed Cutter Voss $320. My father is dead. I have nothing. Voss informed me before I left that the debt did not die with my father, and that if I did not find a way to settle it, he would find a way to help me find a way. Her jaw was very tight. I left because I had run out of patience with his suggestions for how I might find a way. You should have told me this when you wrote. You would not have hired me. I might have hired you regardless. That was truer than he had expected it to sound. But that is not the point. You came onto my property carrying a hidden danger, and that danger extends to everyone on this property, and I needed to know about it. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through whether to be angry at the rebuke or whether to be something else, and the something else won. You are right, she said, and she said it cleanly without resentment. I should have told you. I am sorry. He had expected the anger. The clean admission undid him more than the anger would have. He pulled a chair from the kitchen table and sat down in it, because standing felt suddenly effortful, and he looked at the table instead of at her and said, "Tell me everything about Voss. What you know of him, how he operates, who he is connected to." She sat down across from him and told him, and he listened, and the supper burned a little at the edges, and neither of them mentioned it. Cutter Voss was not a man to be dismissed. That much was clear from Birdie's account. He ran his operations in Santa Fe with a veneer of legitimate business. The gambling establishments were licensed. His name was known to the territorial authorities, and he had enough money and enough connections to keep things that way. He had never been formally accused of anything worse than sharp practice, which meant that whatever methods he used to collect on his debts were either untraceable or unwitnessed or both. He was the kind of danger that was more dangerous for being slow and patient rather than immediate and obvious. Theodore knew that kind of danger. He had grown up with a version of it in Tennessee. He had watched it ruin people who were not prepared for the particular way it worked, the way it came at you from an angle, the way it wrapped itself in legal language and social respectability, until you could not name it clearly enough to fight it. He paid off Samuel Grady's debt to Cutter Voss by bank draft inside of 10 days. He did not tell Birdie he was going to do it. He rode into Cimarron on a Tuesday and sent the draft to Santa Fe with a very short letter under his name and his ranch's heading, and that was that. He paid it out of his operating account, which meant he would need to defer the purchase of 2 new breeding bulls, but that was a manageable inconvenience. He did not tell Birdie because he expected no gratitude and wanted none, and because the decision was a practical one made in the interest of the safety of his property and the people on it. That was the full extent of his reasoning. He was quite certain of this. He was in the kitchen 2 weeks later when she came in from the town, where she had been with Cal to get supplies, and she set down her basket and looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "I received a letter from Santa Fe today," she said. He continued reading the survey report in his hand. "Did you?" "From Cutter Voss." She put the letter on the table between them. "He writes to inform me that the debt has been satisfied by one Theodore Barnett of the Barnett Ranch, Cimarron, and that he considers the matter closed." Silence. "He also writes," she continued, and her voice was doing something careful and deliberate, like a person carrying water in a cup and trying not to spill it, "that he was surprised by the efficiency of the settlement, and that he hopes the arrangement I have made in Cimarron is worth the price that has been paid for it." Theodore put down the survey report. "That last sentence is Voss being unpleasant," he said. "Take no notice of it." "Theodore." She said his name for the first time without the Mr., and something about that stopped him entirely. "You paid $320 for a woman who works in your kitchen." "I paid $320 to remove a threat from my property," he said, "which is my right as the owner of this property and the employer of the people on it. That is the reason. That is the reason." She looked at him for a very long time. Her eyes were doing that thing they did sometimes where they went deeper than the surface and further into him than he had given permission for, and he held very still under it the way he held very still under everything. "Then I will pay you back," she said, "out of my wages. Every month I will put toward it until it is settled." "You do not need to do that. I know I do not need to. I am choosing to. She held his gaze steady. I do not accept gifts I have not earned. If you paid for my freedom, then you paid for something of mine, and I intend to reclaim it properly. He thought about arguing with her. He looked at her face and decided it would be a waste of time and energy. At your current wages, that will take 18 months, he said. Then I will be here for at least 18 months, she said, and she turned back to her basket and began unpacking the supplies, and Theodore picked up the survey report and did not read a single word of it for the next several minutes. 18 months. He sat with that number for a while. He turned it over the way you might turn over a stone to see what was living under it, and what he found living under it was not what he expected, which was the quiet, dangerous recognition that 18 months did not seem, as he would have expected it to seem, like too long. It seemed like not long enough. He put the survey report down and went to the barn before he could do anything inadvisable. The story of what had happened in Tennessee 11 years ago was not something Theodore carried around in the part of himself that was accessible to others. It lived in the sealed-off section he had built over the first year after he arrived in New Mexico, the section reinforced by subsequent years of practice, and by the simple fact that talking about it was both pointless and unbearable. His wife had been named Caroline. She had been 23 when he married her. He had been 24, and they had had 3 years together in the house in Memphis that were not uncomplicated, but were genuinely, fiercely, irreplaceable good years. The kind that a man builds his concept of what life is supposed to feel like on, without knowing he is building it, without knowing the building might one day be taken from him. There had been a fire. The house was his father's house, an old clapboard structure on the east side of Memphis, and the fire started in the kitchen chimney that had needed cleaning for 2 years and never got it. Caroline had been asleep. The fire moved faster than the night hours should have allowed anything to move. Theodore had been in the barn and had seen the light from there, and he had run. He had not been able to reach her. He did not talk about what that meant because there were not words in his possession that were adequate to it, and he had decided a long time ago that words were not the point anyway. The point was the thing he had rebuilt himself into afterward, which was a man who kept everything he valued behind a wall cold enough to discourage fire and loss, and the particular unbearable mathematics of having loved something that could be taken. He had come to New Mexico because New Mexico was stone and desert do not burn the way clapboard does. He had built a stone house. And he had never, in 11 years, lit a fire in the kitchen hearth that he did not immediately supervise. He had not told Birdie this. She could not have known. She was from Santa Fe. She had grown up in a stone-built city. She had packed that kitchen hearth with cedar logs on the night of the 25th of August because the temperature had dropped, and she had wanted to make something that required steady heat for a long time, and she had miscalculated the draft, and the board had caught, and she had put it out herself and gone to sit on the porch because she was either unaware of the danger or unafraid of it. He had not told her. But after that night, the night he had come home from Cimarron in the dark and seen the orange light from half a mile out and run screaming through the smoke, something had cracked in the wall. Not broken through. Just cracked. He sat with her on the back porch for a long time that night, the two of them shoulder to shoulder in the dark, neither of them speaking. The stars over the New Mexico desert in late August were numerous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they do not know they are being looked at, and Birdie sat very still beside him with her loose hair on her shoulders and said nothing until he was ready to speak. He did not tell her about Caroline. Not then. But he said more than he had said to anyone in 11 years, "I do not manage fire well." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I noticed," and then carefully, "Do you want to tell me why?" "Not tonight," he said. Then "Not tonight," she said, and that was enough somehow, that she did not push, that she simply made room for the not yet without treating it as a closed door. He went to his bed at midnight and slept better than he had in a long time. The crack in the wall widened slowly, the way cracks in stone walls do, over the following weeks, through September and into the first cold days of October. It widened when he discovered, by accident, that she had been teaching herself to read Spanish from a grammar book she had found in his study. And when he offered to help her, she accepted with such immediate and uncomplicated pleasure that he sat across from her at the kitchen table for 2 hours that evening going through verb conjugations, and could not afterward account for where the time had gone. It widened when he came in from a bad day in the south pasture. 3 cattle lost to a flash flooding of the arroyo that should not have flooded and had cost him money, and cost him more than money in the time he had spent losing a battle he should have been able to prevent. And she had simply put a plate of food in front of him and sat down and said, "Tell me what happened," and listened to him talk about it for 20 minutes with a focused attention that made him feel, for the first time in a very long time, that what he was carrying was being carried by more than one person. It widened on a Tuesday in early October when Cal came in from town with the news that a man had been asking questions about the Barnett Ranch, specifically about whether there was a woman named Birdie Grady living there, and Theodore had the cold, narrow thing at the back of his ribs again, immediate and certain. He told Birdie over dinner directly because she had earned directness and he was done managing information on her behalf. She went still when he told her. Then she said, "Voss." "Most likely someone working for him," Theodore said. "The debt is settled, but a man like Voss does not always think of debt in purely financial terms." She absorbed that. He watched her process it, the small tightening around her eyes, the way her hands lay flat on the table in a deliberate act of steadiness. "He is angry," she said. "That someone paid it so quickly that I slipped away cleanly." She looked up at him. "I am sorry I have brought this to your door. You did not bring it, it followed you." He held her gaze. "And I have dealt with worse things following me than a small-time criminal with a grievance. Do not apologize. I am still Birdie." The use of her name alone stopped her. He had not meant to use just her name, but he had, and they both heard it, the softening in it, the thing it admitted just by existing. "Do not apologize," he said again. "We will manage it." "We," he had said. "Not I, not you. We." She looked at him, and the amber in her eyes was warm and steady in the lantern light, and he looked away first. He rode to Cimarron the next morning and spoke to the county sheriff, a man named Aldridge who owed Theodore a fair amount of goodwill for unrelated reasons, and made sure that any stranger asking about the Barnett Ranch had a reason to believe that asking questions there would carry consequences. Then he wrote another letter to Santa Fe, this one considerably less polite than the first, making it clear to Cutter Voss that the matter was closed from every angle, and that Voss's interest in anyone residing at the Barnett Ranch was no longer welcome or without legal risk. He did not hear from Voss again. He came back from the second trip to Cimarron in late October to find Birdie in the yard teaching herself to rope, using a coil of old hemp and a fence post as a target, with a focused and slightly angry concentration that suggested she had been at it for some time. She was not bad at it. She had the basics of the wrist motion, and she had figured out the footwork. But she was overthrowing because she had been told to grip too hard by someone who did not know what they were talking about, which was probably Denny. He walked to the fence and took the rope from her and showed her the grip, the way you hold it loose enough that it moves through your fingers, and stood behind her slightly to guide the motion. And he was close enough that he could smell the soap she used and the sun on her hair, and he did not breathe for a few seconds while he adjusted her wrist angle. "Like that," he said, and stepped back. She threw the rope and it settled over the fence post perfectly, and she turned with an expression of such unguarded delight that he felt the crack in the wall spread another inch. "I have been doing it wrong for an hour," she said. "Denny grips too hard," he said. "He taught you that. He was trying to help." "I know he was." He looked at the rope on the post. "You learn quickly." "I am motivated," she said, and pulled the rope free and coiled it again. "My father raised me to be self-sufficient." He was not always consistent about it, but on that point he was very clear. A woman who can do things for herself is harder to make helpless. Theodore looked at her. Sounds like he was worth knowing. Her expression softened into something private and a little sad. He was. He was also reckless and sometimes foolish, and he made decisions that left me in difficult situations. But he loved me without reservation, and that is not a thing you can replicate. She looked down at the rope in her hands. I miss him considerably. When did he die? January. She looked up. This past January. The pneumonia took him very fast. He was sick for 9 days. Theodore said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I am sorry. Thank you. She met his eyes. Have you lost people? It was a direct question, not intrusive, the way she asked direct questions, as if she had decided that honesty was worth more than comfort and was prepared to receive the answer whatever it was. Yes, he said. She waited. My wife, he said. It was the first time he had said those words aloud in 11 years, and they felt strange in his mouth, like words from a language he used to speak fluently that he had mostly lost through disuse. Her name was Caroline. In 1872, there was a fire. Birdie was very still. I am so sorry, she said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of any excessive performance of sympathy, hit him somewhere deep and unprotected. It was a long time ago, he said, the way people say things that are a long time ago but not at any kind of distance. Those two things are not always connected, she said quietly. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The October afternoon was clear and cold around them, and the mountains stood purple on the horizon, and the fence post stood between them with the coiled rope at its foot, and Theodore Barnett felt, standing in his own yard on a Tuesday afternoon, that the crack in the wall had become something more than a crack. It had become a window. He was not ready to call it that. He was not ready for the implications of it. But he could not close it either. And that night he sat in the front room for a long time after supper while Birdie read in the chair across from him, and the lamp burned between them. And he thought that perhaps this was what it looked like, the thing he had kept so cold for so long, when someone with enough patience and enough fire sat next to it long enough to warm it. He did not tell her any of that. But he stayed in the room instead of retreating to his study. And she looked up once from her book and found him watching the lamp rather than her, and she turned a page and said nothing, which was exactly right. The winter of 1883 came hard and early to New Mexico, the first snow arriving in the second week of November before the cattle had all been moved to the lower pastures, which meant Theodore and Cal and Denny were working from before dawn until after dark for nearly 2 weeks in conditions that were cold and relentless and occasionally dangerous. He came in at night bone tired, and she had food on the table, and the house was warm, and he sat down at the kitchen table with snow still melting off his coat and ate, and said almost nothing, and she did not require him to say anything, just sat across from him and ate her own supper, and sometimes talked a little about what had happened in the house, or the yard that day, ordinary domestic detail, the kind of talk that has no content and enormous weight. On the 12th night of the cattle work, he came in from the dark and found her asleep in the kitchen chair, which she had pulled to the hearth, with her book open in her lap and the fire down to coals. She had stayed up for him. She was still in her day dress, not yet ready for bed, which meant she had intended to be awake when he came in, and she had simply not made it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, the firelight on her face, and the thing he had been managing and containing and refusing to name for 5 months rose up with a clarity that was almost like pain. He crossed the kitchen and very gently removed the book from her lap and put it on the table, and she stirred but did not fully wake. He took the blanket from the back of the chair and put it over her, and she settled into it with a small, unconscious sigh that undid him entirely, and he stood over her with his cold hands at his sides, and understood with absolute certainty that he was in love with Birdie Grady. He understood it the way you understand things you have been carefully not understanding for a very long time, in a single clear rush that leaves no room for argument. He did not act on it. He went to bed and lay awake for several hours, and had a series of extremely cogent conversations with himself about the situation. She was an employee. She was on his property partly out of financial necessity. She owed him money, a debt she was paying back diligently. The power dynamics of the situation were not uncomplicated. The last thing a woman in her position needed was her employer deciding that he was in love with her. He decided to maintain his distance. He managed this for approximately 8 days, which covered the remainder of the cattle work and the first week of December, and then the thing that broke his resolve was not dramatic. It was Birdie at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the account ledgers again, and she looked up when he came in and said, "I have been thinking about the spring breeding schedule. I believe if you move the timing on the western herd by 2 weeks you would avoid the overlap with the spring flood season and reduce the risk of losing calves to the arroyo." She slid the ledger across the table to where she had made a diagram. "Tell me if I am wrong." He looked at the diagram. It was precisely correct. He looked at her face, at the completely unself-conscious way she was waiting for him to engage with the idea, at the fact that she had spent her own time on a Saturday morning thinking about the long-term productivity of his operation with no requirement that he acknowledge it as anything beyond a practical contribution. "You are not wrong," he said. She nodded once, the satisfaction of a person who had thought through a problem correctly. "Birdie," he said. She looked up. He sat down across from her at the table. He put his hands flat on the table the way she sometimes did, the deliberate steadiness. He looked at the ledger between them and then at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it directly because you have earned directness from me and I intend to continue giving it to you." She was very still. Her amber eyes were watching him. "I have been maintaining a distance from you that I told myself was appropriate given the circumstances," he said. "I have been telling myself that the circumstances make anything else improper." She said nothing. He kept going. "I am aware that you work for me and that you have a debt to me that you are paying back, and that those two things complicate this conversation. I want you to know that neither of those things has any bearing on what I am about to say, and that if what I say is unwelcome, you may decline to acknowledge it entirely, and I will maintain the same professional relationship we have had, and neither of us will speak of it again." She was watching him with an expression that was very careful and very warm at the same time. "I think," he said, and the words were difficult in a way that surprised him, not because they were false, but because they were so completely true that saying them aloud felt like stepping off a known edge into an unknown depth, "that you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time. I think that this house has been better for your presence in it in ways that I did not know I needed it to be better. I think that I have not wanted someone's good opinion as much as I have wanted yours in more years than I can count. And I think that if you were free of obligation to me, and if the circumstances were clear, I would want very much to know what you think of me in return." Silence. Birdie looked at him for a long time. He could see her thinking, the careful, thorough way she thought through things, taking it apart and examining each piece. "The circumstances are not uncomplicated," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But you named them," she said. "You put them on the table where I can see them, which is the honest thing." She looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. "I will tell you what I think of you, Theodore Barnett, because you asked directly and you have always given me directness and I owe you the same." She took a breath. "I think you are the most careful and most frightened person I have ever met. I think you built yourself into something cold because something hot burned you and you decided that was safer. I think that coldness has been very expensive for you, even if it has felt necessary. And I think that for about 3 months now I have been doing something I told myself I would absolutely not do, which is care about you considerably more than is professionally appropriate." Theodore held very still. "The debt," she said. "I will continue to pay it back because that is important to me, and you will accept that because that is important to me also." "I will accept it," he said. "And the position," she said. "I would like to keep working. I am good at this work and I find it meaningful, and I do not want to stop doing it because of what either of us feels. The position is yours as long as you want it," he said. "Then," she said, and something in her face shifted, The careful layer went down and what was underneath it came up, warm and direct and uncomplicated. "I would like to know what you think we should do about this." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the winter light coming through the window and the December cold around them, and the account ledgers between them and the whole long, careful distance he had built over 11 years, and he said, "I think we should begin." They began slowly, the way that people begin things when they are both carrying the weight of previous loss and present vulnerability, and a healthy respect for the fragility of good things. Theodore did not rush, which was partly his nature and partly intentional care, and Birdie did not push, which was also both her nature and intentional care. And between the two of them they negotiated something that was courtship in the oldest and most deliberate sense of the word. He rode with her to Cimarron on a Saturday in December, the first time he had taken her to town for any reason other than supply runs, and he bought her coffee at the hotel restaurant, and they sat across from each other in a wood-paneled room with 4 other people present, and talked for 2 hours about books, about his years in Tennessee, about her childhood in Santa Fe, about her mother who had died when she was 12, and her father's subsequent unreliable but loving stewardship of her adolescence. He told her more about Caroline than he had intended to, not the whole story but more, the shape of it, the loss, and she listened with her full attention and said at the end, "She sounds like she was worth grieving the way you have grieved her." He did not know what to do with that sentence for a while. Then he understood that it was the most honest and the kindest thing anyone had ever said to him on the subject. He took her hand on the way back to the wagon and she let him keep it. December became January, and January became February, and the months turned in the particular slow way of winter on the range, with work that was unrelenting and cold that was physical and constant. And through all of it something was building between them that had the quality of something permanent, the way stone builds rather than the way wood builds, slowly and under pressure, and with a solidity that does not announce itself. He kissed her for the first time in January, on the back porch on a clear night with the temperature well below freezing and the stars enormous and close, and she had been pointing out a constellation she had learned from a vaquero her father had employed years ago, one she was not certain of the name of, and he had been watching her face rather than the sky, and she had turned to find him watching her, and it had been entirely simple, the most natural thing, a mutual movement rather than a unilateral decision. She was warm. She was the particular warm of someone who has been cold outside for a while, and she put her hand on his jaw and he thought, briefly and then not at all, of the wall that had been there for 11 years and the crack that had become a window. "Theodore," she said, with her forehead against his. "Yes," he said, because it seemed like the right answer to whatever she had been about to say. She laughed, a soft sound that went directly into the cold and made it warmer, and he thought he had not heard himself say yes to anything in years. Not in that way, not as an opening rather than a closing. Cal and Denny were diplomatic about noticing the change in the household, which is to say they noticed it immediately and said nothing directly, but communicated their approval through a series of increasingly transparent behavioral signals. Cal began appearing in the kitchen for reasons that had nothing to do with food even more frequently than before. Denny started putting his hat back on every time he came inside, which was his version of elevated social ceremony. Theodore observed this and found it less irritating than he expected. The town of Cimarron, for its part, noticed when Theodore Barnett began appearing in the hotel restaurant on Saturday afternoons with a young woman who was, by all accounts, his housekeeper, and the town made the calculations that small towns make, and some of those calculations were uncharitable and some were not. Sheriff Aldridge, who was a practical man, said to Theodore one afternoon in February, "People are going to talk, Theodore. You know that." "People are always talking about something," Theodore said. "They are saying things that are not flattering to Miss Grady," Aldridge said. Theodore looked at him. "What kinds of things?" "The kind that assume the worst about a woman who lives in a man's house." "I see." He was very still. Are these the same people who have never credited Miss Grady with any intelligence or agency? Probably. Aldridge looked at him steadily. I am not telling you this to criticize. I am telling you because I thought you would want to know. Theodore rode home from town and did not immediately address what Aldridge had said, but he sat with it through supper, and through the evening, and the next morning he found Birdie in the kitchen and said, without preliminary, I want to ask you something. She turned from the stove. Then ask it. I want to ask it properly, he said. I want you to know before I ask it that it is not an answer to anything practical. It is not a solution to a social problem. It is something I would ask you regardless of any external consideration. She was very still. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and he was not a man who was comfortable with ceremony, so he did not manufacture ceremony. He said, I want to marry you, not because it is the obvious answer to the question of us. Because you are who you are, and because you have done something to me that I was certain could not be done, and because I want to wake up in the same house as you for as many years as we both have, and I want it to be permanent and acknowledged, and I want you to know that everything I have is already yours whether you say yes or not. Birdie looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were bright in a way that was something very specific, the particular brightness of someone who is trying to hold a feeling that is bigger than containment. You are the most inarticulate romantic I have ever encountered, she said. I know, he said, but you meant every word of it. Every word, he said. Then yes, she said. Obviously yes, Theodore, he exhaled. She put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and the stove behind her was warming the kitchen, and outside the February wind moved across the stone walls of the house, and inside it was warm. They were married in Cimarron on a Saturday in March of 1884, in a small ceremony at the county office with Sheriff Aldridge and his wife as witnesses. Because Theodore was not a church-going man, and Birdie had said she did not need a church to make something true. She wore a blue dress she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks, a deep clear blue that she said matched the color of the mountains at a certain hour of the afternoon, and Theodore wore his good coat and his clean hat. And when the judge asked him if he would take this woman, he said yes, with considerably more expression than he normally permitted himself to put into a single word. Cal cried at the small dinner they held afterward at the ranch house, which embarrassed him enormously, and which Birdie treated as the most natural thing in the world by handing him a handkerchief without comment. Denny made a toast that was 4 sentences long and managed to contain more genuine emotion per word than most speeches 10 times its length. They ate well and drank moderately, and in the evening their guests departed and the house was quiet. Theodore stood on the back porch in the March night and looked at the mountains, and Birdie came to stand beside him and put her hand in his arm the way she had in Cimarron. And the night was cold and clear, and the stars were out, and the whole enormous dark desert lay around them, and he felt, in a way that was completely without precedent in his recent decades, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Are you happy? She asked. He considered the question seriously, because she was a person who appreciated serious consideration of questions. Yes, he said. I think this is what that is. She leaned against his arm. I think so too. Spring came to the territory with the particular violence of New Mexico spring, rain that was almost horizontal and winds that made the horses nervous, and the high desert blooming in colors that seemed excessive after the brown months of winter. Theodore and Birdie moved through the spring work together in a way that was different from the careful professional arrangement of the previous year, a partnership that had found its rhythm, each of them knowing the other's capacities and limits and preferences, each of them making room for the other's way of doing things. She continued to do the accounts, which she had become genuinely expert at. She continued to run the kitchen and the house, which remained excellent. She also began to take on more work with the cattle in a quiet, incremental way that reflected her own desire to understand the operation fully. And Theodore found that working alongside her in the south pasture, or at the branding, was not the awkward thing he might have expected, but was simply work, made more enjoyable by the presence of someone he liked. He paid back the full amount of what she had been repaying him from her wages one afternoon in April, not as a grand gesture, but as a bookkeeping correction. A simple note in the ledger that balanced it to zero, with an explanation in his own hand that said, "Your wages for the past 11 months do not reflect the actual value of what you have contributed. Consider this an adjustment." He left the ledger open on the kitchen table and said nothing about it. She found it that evening and came to the doorway of his study and looked at him. "This is not how accounting works," she said. "It is how it works at this ranch," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer and then said, "Thank you," quietly, and went back to the kitchen. And he heard her singing to herself, the old low Southern song, and he sat very still in his study and let it fill the house. The summer of 1884 was dry and hot and long, and there were challenges that came with it. A dispute with a neighboring ranch over water rights, to an arroyo channel that required Theodore to ride twice to Cimarron for legal consultation, and once to Santa Fe, which was the first time he had been to Santa Fe since before Birdie's arrival. She did not come with him on that trip, because the ranch required management, and she was better at managing it than anyone. But he wrote her a letter from Santa Fe, which he had never written a letter to anyone in New Mexico before. And it was not a long letter, but it was specific about the things he missed about the ranch while he was away from it, which were mostly things about her, and he sent it and did not overthink it. She kept the letter. He discovered this months later, finding it in the small box where she kept her father's letters, and he did not tell her he had seen it, but he thought about it for a long time afterward, with a warmth that was by now entirely familiar. The water rights dispute was settled in Theodore's favor by August, which meant the western herd had access to the Arroyo Channel through the dry season, and the crisis was managed. In September, Birdie told him she was expecting. He was in the yard repairing a section of fence when she came out to find him, and she said it the way she said most things, directly and without excessive preamble. And he stood with the fence post in his hands and looked at her in the September afternoon, and felt something that was not contained in any category he had language for. He set down the fence post and he crossed the yard and he held her, which was not a thing he did easily, the full physical articulation of feeling, and she held him back with her face against his shoulder, and he said very quietly into her hair, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am actually extremely well." He held her for a long time. The mountains were going gold at the edges, and the air had the first cool thread of autumn in it, and the fence post lay in the dirt, and he did not care about it at all. The pregnancy was not easy, which Birdie did not advertise and which Theodore noticed anyway, because he was attentive to her in ways that he was not attentive to other things, and she could not entirely conceal the mornings that were bad and the afternoons when she was tired in ways that went beyond the ordinary. He adjusted things without being asked, taking on more of the kitchen work himself in the early months with a willingness that surprised both of them, learning to make a limited number of things with reasonable competence, because it seemed the right thing to do, and because it gave him something useful to do with the concern he could not entirely suppress. Birdie found this hilarious and touching in equal measure. "You are burning the biscuits," she told him one morning from her chair at the kitchen table. "I am not burning them," he said, checking the pan. "They are darker than intended. That is the definition of burning. They are edible. They are enthusiastically brown." He looked at the pan and then at her, and she was trying very hard not to laugh, and he said, "I will try again," with the gravity of a man engaged in important work, and she put her head down on her arms on the table and laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. He thought, watching her, that if he had been told 11 years ago in the ruins of a burned house in Memphis that he would one day stand in a stone kitchen in New Mexico trying to make biscuits while a woman laughed at his attempts, and that this would be the best morning he could imagine, he would not have believed it possible. He was glad he had been wrong. Cal and Denny received the news of the coming child with the same transparent enthusiasm they had brought to the marriage. Cal immediately began constructing a cradle in the bunkhouse during his off hours, an endeavor that was far more ambitious than his carpentry skills strictly warranted. And Denny developed the habit of appearing at the kitchen door in the evenings on the pretext of needing a tool or asking a question, and then lingering for half an hour in a way that had nothing to do with tools or questions. The town of Cimarron, which had been watching the Barnett situation since March with the focused attention of a community that does not have as much entertainment as it would like, had largely revised its earlier uncharitable opinions in light of the evidence of the marriage and the apparent contentment of both parties. Mrs. Aldridge, who was the primary social arbiter of Cimarron and who had been cautiously neutral through the winter and spring, made a call at the ranch in October that amounted to an official declaration that Birdie Barnett was to be considered a person of standing in the community. And since no one particularly wanted to disagree with Mrs. Aldridge, the matter was settled. Birdie received Mrs. Aldridge with the quiet warmth and complete social competence that had been on display in the kitchen since July of 1883, and made coffee, and served it correctly, and discussed the coming fall and the state of the territory with a directness and substance that Mrs. Aldridge found so refreshing that she stayed an extra hour and left recommending Birdie Barnett to every woman in town. Theodore, who had observed this visit from the barn with the detached strategic interest of a man who understood that social battles were real battles even when no one was shooting, said to Birdie afterward, "You handled that excellently." "She is a good woman underneath the ceremony," Birdie said. "She came to be certain I was all right. I appreciated it." Theodore considered this. "I had not thought of it that way." "She has daughters," Birdie said. "Women with daughters think about these things." He thought about his daughter in the quiet way he had been thinking about his child for 2 months, the particular wondering that had become one of the primary textures of his interior life since September. "We will have one or the other," he said. "Or both, eventually." "Both would be good," she said, and then smiled at him with something in her eyes that was deep and sure and entirely his. The baby was born on the 2nd of February, 1885, which was a cold, clear night with the moon full on the snow that had fallen that week, and the mountains white and enormous against the sky. Theodore sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in the way that men of the time were made to wait outside of rooms that contained the most important things happening in their lives, listening to Birdie's voice, and later her silence, and the voice of the woman who had come from town to assist, and the voice of Birdie again, and then finally a new voice, the thin, strong, insistent voice of someone who had just arrived and was very annoyed about the cold. He was allowed in after what felt like a separate epoch. Birdie lay against the pillows with the particular exhaustion and exhilaration of someone who has done the hardest thing, and she looked at him when he came in with an expression that was made of more things than he had names for. In her arms was a small, red-faced person who appeared to be deeply unimpressed with the world so far. "A boy," the woman from town said, with the satisfaction of a delivering good news. Theodore sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the thing that happened to him in that moment was large enough and complex enough that it pushed through every wall and closed door and accumulated caution, and arrived in him complete and overwhelming, and he did not try to contain it. He put his hand very carefully on his son's head. The baby opened his eyes, dark and unfocused, and did not immediately object to the hand. "He looks like he has opinions," Theodore said. "He is your son," Birdie said, dry even through the exhaustion. "Of course he has opinions." Theodore looked at her. She was looking at him with the tired, clear, certain eyes of a woman who knew exactly where she was and exactly what she had built and was not unaware of the weight of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am better than all right," she said. He took her free hand and held it and did not say anything else, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already in the room. They named him Samuel for her father. Theodore had suggested it, and Birdie had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Yes," with her voice slightly unsteady, and he had taken her hand and they had sat with it together. Samuel Theodore Barnett arrived in the world in February of 1885 and proceeded immediately to occupy the center of it with an authority that seemed improbable for someone who weighed 7 pounds. Cal finished the cradle, and it was actually very good, which surprised everyone including Cal. Denny appeared at the kitchen door on the third day with a carved wooden horse he had clearly been working on in secret, and which he handed to Theodore with a gruffness designed to minimize the emotional content of the gesture, and which failed entirely. Spring came again, and Samuel grew with the astonishing speed of things that are new, and the ranch expanded in small ways. The 2 breeding bulls Theodore had deferred purchased in March. The vegetable garden extended, a new section of fencing in the north pasture. Theodore hired a third hand, a young man named Oscar who was 17 and had been working at a neighboring ranch and who came to the Barnett property with a recommendation from Sheriff Aldridge and proved himself worth keeping inside of a month. The territory itself was changing around them, the way the West was changing in 1885. The long era of open range slowly giving way to something more structured and more settled. The railroad making its presence felt even in places the tracks had not yet reached. The towns becoming more substantial. The old wildness being edited down by settlement and law and the increasing complexity of legal ownership. Theodore watched this with the attention he gave to all significant changes in his environment and made his adjustments, extending his water rights documentation, formalized his property boundaries with new survey markers, building relationships with the newer commercial interests in Cimarron that the railroad era was bringing in. Birdie was his partner in this, the way she was his partner in everything. She had a quality of mind that moved between the immediate practical and the long-term strategic without losing either, and her social intelligence, the kind that understood how people worked and what they needed, and how to give them what they needed without losing your own ground, was something Theodore lacked and relied on, and had begun to think of as essential in a way that went beyond the professional. He told her this one evening in the summer, in the direct way that was by now the natural idiom of their marriage. "You know that I depend on you," he said. "I know," she said, without complacency, just acknowledgement. "I mean it more broadly than the ranch," he said. "I mean I depend on the way your mind works, the way you read situations, the way you know things about people that I miss." She looked at him across the kitchen table with Samuel asleep in the bedroom and the summer evening warm around them. "You do not miss as much as you think," she said. "You see everything. You just do not always know what to do with what you see. That is an accurate description of a significant portion of my life until you arrived," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile she had for things he said that she would keep, the way she kept the letter in the box with her father's letters. He said, because it was true and because she deserved to hear it, "I was not whole before you. I functioned very well, but I was not whole." She looked at him for a moment, and then she got up and came around the table and put her arms around him from behind and pressed her face against the back of his neck and did not say anything, which was exactly enough. Samuel was walking by October and had words by December, and was a person of very clear views about the world by the time he was 2, with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and a combination of his mother's warmth and his father's stubbornness that was going to be interesting to manage as he got older. He learned the names of the horses before he could reliably name all the adults in his vicinity. He had Denny wrapped around his finger inside of a week, and had learned to deploy that shamelessly by 18 months. Theodore watched his son in the way that fathers watch children, with a continuous wondering that does not diminish, with the particular quality of love that is also terror, because it is so entirely without the caution that keeps most love manageable. He had thought for a long time that the lesson of Caroline was that love was too expensive, that opening yourself to losing something was not something a wise person did twice. He understood now, at 39, watching his son attempt to instruct a cattle dog in a task the dog had no intention of performing, that the opposite was true. The alternative to loving things was not safety. It was just the 11 empty years he had spent building a cold house and calling it a refuge. He was not going to build any more cold houses. The second child came in the spring of 1887, a girl, which Birdie had apparently been expecting based on something she said she simply knew, and which arrived in April with considerably less drama than Samuel had and considerably more immediate personality. They named her Eliza, for Theodore's mother, which pleased him in a way he had not anticipated feeling about the use of old names, and she was from the beginning a small, fierce person with dark hair and amber eyes, and a laugh that could be heard from the far end of the garden. Samuel received Eliza with the conflicted dignity of an elder sibling who has been informed of his responsibility and is not entirely sure how he feels about it, transitioning over approximately 6 weeks from suspicious detachment to fierce protection. And by the time Eliza was 3 months old, Samuel was her loudest advocate in every room. Theodore found this so charming that it caused him a series of private moments of amusement he was careful not to let Cal and Denny observe. The ranch in 1887 was a different thing from the ranch of 1883. It was larger and more productive and better organized and more connected to the networks of the territory. It employed 5 people, and the house had been extended with a new room on the south side. The vegetable garden was a serious operation that supplied more than the household needed. The cattle operation had been rationalized along the lines Birdie had sketched out in that Saturday morning ledger session in December of 1883, and the results were visible in the accounts. Oscar had become a permanent member of the operation, steady and skilled, with the flat competence of a young man who had found his place. Cal had gotten engaged to a girl in Cimarron, which was a development that appeared to have surprised him more than anyone, and which Birdie had celebrated with such warmth and genuine pleasure that Theodore had watched her doing it, and thought that this was one of the things she did that he could not do, the full entering into another person's good news as if it were your own. He had tried to learn it from her with partial success. He was better at it than he had been. He was better at a lot of things than he had been. Denny, asked if he was ever going to get married a 3rd time, had said that 2 attempts seemed sufficient for 1 lifetime, and that he was content where he was, and this had been accepted without further argument. On a clear morning in June of 1887, Theodore came in from the range earlier than usual, before noon, having finished a piece of fence repair in shorter time than expected, and found the house empty except for the sound of Birdie's voice in the kitchen. He went through to the kitchen and found her there with Eliza on her hip and Samuel at her feet playing with the carved horse Denny had given him, and she was singing to Eliza, the low old Southern song, the one he had heard through doorways and windows all through the years of her time at the ranch. She did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway and watched, the way he had stood in the doorway on the morning of his first real seeing of what she was, and the kitchen was full of morning light, and Eliza was watching her mother's face with the absolute trusting attention of the very young, and Samuel was narrating something to the wooden horse about a cattle drive, and the hearth was going with a controlled, careful fire that kept the kitchen warm. He had not been afraid of the kitchen fire for some time now. He had not noticed when it stopped being something he managed with dread and became something he managed with ordinary attention, and he thought it was probably because she had happened between the dread and the now, and whatever she had done to the sealed architecture of his interior, it had changed the thermodynamics of the whole place. She looked up and saw him, and her face went through its small, private opening, the expression she had only for him. "You are early," she said. "I finished the north fence," he said. He came fully into the kitchen and leaned down and kissed Eliza's head, and Eliza grabbed for his ear with the intention of a child who has decided that possession is the highest form of greeting, and he let her take it. Samuel looked up. "Papa, I am explaining the route." "To the horse," Theodore said. "He needs to understand," Samuel said with great dignity. Theodore looked at his son and felt the enormous wordless swell of the thing that had no adequate name, and then looked at his wife, who was watching him with her steady, warm eyes over the top of Eliza's dark head, and he thought about the 11 years of cold silence and the 47 days of careful professional distance, and the night he had run through smoke and found her on the porch, and all the long, beautiful, ordinary months since. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from the side, careful of Eliza, and she leaned against him, and the fire kept the kitchen warm, and outside the summer was brilliant over the mountains. "I love you," he said, because he had gotten better at saying it and because she deserved to hear it on a regular basis and because it was simply and completely true. "I know," she said. "I love you also." She turned her face up to his. "I have since the biscuits." "The biscuits were fine," he said. "They were not fine," she said. "But you made them for me, and that was everything." Samuel, sensing that the adults were doing something that was not about him, abandoned the horse and stood up and inserted himself between their legs with the resourcefulness of a child who will not be overlooked, and Theodore looked down at him, and the feeling in his chest was so large it was almost structural, like the stone walls of the house, load-bearing. He reached down and picked Samuel up, and Eliza was still attached to his ear, and Birdie was laughing beside him, and the kitchen was warm with the fire she had lit, and he stood in the middle of it and let it burn. He had been the coldest man in the territory. That was accurate, and he would not dispute it. He had been cold in the particular way of a man who has been burned, and decided that cold was the only safe temperature, and he had kept himself there through an act of continuous disciplined will for 11 years. But Birdie Grady had walked into his kitchen with her dark hair and her direct eyes and her pride and her practicality and her way of seeing through walls rather than around them, and she had lit a fire, and she had not let it go out, and he had finally let it warm him all the way down to the place where the cold had lived. He was warm now. He intended to stay that way. The years continued forward with the forward momentum of years, and the territory changed around the Barnett ranch the way territories do, slowly and then all at once. The railroad came to within 30 miles of Cimarron by 1889, which changed the economics of cattle in ways that required adjustment and presented new opportunities for a man willing to engage with the new networks. Theodore engaged with them, methodically and with the long view he had always brought to strategy, and the ranch grew and diversified, adding sheep to the east section, and a small grain operation that Birdie had proposed based on her reading about dryland farming in the agricultural bulletins she had begun subscribing to. She read everything. He had known this about her early, and it had remained one of his consistent sources of quiet pleasure, watching her work through an idea from the first encounter with it in print to the practical application, the way she brought the same thoroughness to a new agricultural technique, or a piece of territorial legislation, or a grammar book in Spanish. She had become fluent in Spanish by 1886, which was useful in the territory, and which had opened relationships with several of the Hispanic families in the region that proved genuinely important to the ranch operation. Theodore's own Spanish had improved substantially under her guidance, though she maintained to the end of the decade that his conjugations were correct and his intonation was terrifying. Eliza was riding by age 4. Samuel was helping with real cattle work by age 6. The children grew up in the wide space of the ranch, with the mountains on the horizon, and the Spanish-speaking vaqueros who came through, and the particular freedom of children who are trusted and watched, and allowed to discover things for themselves within boundaries that are firm and clear and consistently enforced. Theodore was a different father from the father he had been afraid he might be, the one who held too much back, who kept his children at the same cold distance he had kept everyone else. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he was a present one, and Birdie had taught him, without ever framing it as instruction, that presence was the thing that mattered, that showing up to the small things was the whole of it. He showed up to the small things. He taught Samuel to rope and to read a range map and to understand the accounts. He taught Eliza the same things, because Birdie's father had raised her to be self-sufficient, and he was raising his daughter the same way. And because the territory was changing, but there would always be a use for a person who could do things. He read to them in the evenings when the work was done, history and geography, and the great novels that Birdie had accumulated on the shelf she had begun building in the front room, starting with the books from her own bag and expanding year by year until it was the largest thing in the room. He had not been a reader before her. He was one now. On the last day of 1889, the final evening of the decade, Theodore and Birdie sat on the back porch in the cold with blankets around them, and the children asleep inside, and the new year an hour away. The sky was the absolute clear black of desert winter, enormous and precise and indifferent in its beauty, and the mountains were a dark weight on the horizon, and the whole quiet land lay around them. 10 years ago, Theodore said, I was sitting in this house alone and calling it preference. Birdie looked at him. Was it? It was a well-constructed lie, he said. The kind you tell yourself so often it stops feeling like a lie. She was quiet for a moment. I was in Santa Fe, she said. My father was alive and getting into the debt that would eventually send me to you. And I was trying to manage things I could not fully manage and telling myself it would resolve itself. She looked at the mountains. We were both practicing something that was not quite the thing we needed. You arrived in July of 1883, he said, and I met you at the stage with the minimum courtesy required. You picked up my bag, she said. That was more than minimum. I was raised to pick up bags, he said, and I noticed, she said, that your hands shook a little when you did it. He turned to look at her. They did not shake. They did, she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has been paying close attention for 7 years. You were very composed on top, and your hands shook a little when you picked up the bag, and I thought, this man is not as cold as he intends to be, and I filed it away. He looked at her for a long moment. You noticed that on the first day. I notice things, she said. I learned it from you, actually. You just notice them and put them somewhere no one can see. I notice them and try to understand what they mean. And what did it mean, he said. The hands. She looked at him steadily in the cold dark. That something had gotten to you already, before I had done a thing. She held his gaze. I do not know if it was me or the situation or the letter or the 40 acres or something else entirely. But something had already cracked it just slightly, and I thought, if I am careful, and if I am patient, and if I am honest, there might be something worth finding on the other side of the crack. He thought about the wall and the window. He thought about the 11 years and the first day and the morning he had run through smoke, and the night on the back porch, and the kitchen table, and the December kitchen, and the February night, and all the ordinary marvelous days between. He thought about Samuel and Eliza asleep inside, and the ranch that was something genuine now, not just a place a man had made himself cold enough to survive. He took her hand under the blanket. You were right, he said. I usually am, she said, with the small particular smile she reserved for things she had waited a long time to say. He laughed. The sound of it went out into the cold night air and dispersed into the enormous sky, and she squeezed his hand, and the new year was coming with whatever it would bring, and he was ready for it in a way he had not been ready for anything for a very long time. I want to tell you something, he said. Then tell me, she said. I want to tell you that the years since you came have been the best of my life. He said it directly, without decoration, the way he said things, but he let it be full rather than spare. I know that is not a complicated sentence, but I want you to know it is exact, and I have thought about it, and I mean it precisely. Birdie turned and looked at him in the dark with the stars above them and the cold of a New Mexico December around them, and the warm house behind them with their children sleeping and their life fully built and ongoing and alive. The best of mine too, she said, without question. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the last hour of the 1880s moved quietly around them, and the fire in the kitchen hearth, banked low for the night, kept the house warm all the way to the walls. In the morning there would be work. There was always work. The cattle needed moving in January, and the north fence still had a section that would need attention in the spring. And Eliza had announced that she wanted to learn to read Spanish the way her mother had. And Samuel had said gravely that he thought the ranch needed a second dog. And there were accounts to go over and decisions to make, and the long, productive life of a working ranch to continue attending to. In the morning there would be all of that, and the ordinary details of a life that was full and ongoing, and that rewarded the attention given to it. But right now, in the last hour of the decade, Theodore Barnett sat on the back porch of his stone house with his wife against his shoulder and her hand in his, and the whole vast New Mexico night around them, and he was warm, and he was not alone, and the fire was burning. It had been burning for years now, steady and controlled and true, the way fires burn in kitchens that are properly tended, the way fires burn in houses where someone has decided to stay. He had been the coldest man in the territory. And she had come into his kitchen and lit a fire and left it burning, and he had finally had the sense to let it warm him all the way to the place where he lived, and to keep it going, and to tend it with everything he had. He looked up at the enormous sky. He was, at 37, 38, 39, 40, and onward, a man who had been given back something he had thought was permanently lost, not the same thing but something new, something built from the wreckage of the old loss and the patience of a woman who knew what cold felt like and had decided to bring warmth anyway. That was the whole story. That was all of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.